Zara stood on the observation deck of the Alliance flagship watching the stars blur past as they traveled through hyperspace. And she had seen this view 1,000 times before. But tonight it felt different, because tomorrow everything would change, and she could feel it in all three of her hearts that beat in rhythm with the ship's engines. She was a Valorian warrior, and her people had ruled the eastern quadrant of the galaxy for over 3,000 cycles, and they were feared by every species that knew their name because Valorians did not lose battles and they did not show mercy to those who threatened the peace they had built with blood and steel. Her silver skin reflected the light from distant stars, and her amber eyes glowed with an inner fire that had been lit the day she took her first life in combat at the age of 12 cycles, which was young even by Valorian standards. But Zara had always been different, and she had always been better than the rest. The war with the Crethon swarm had been going on for 5 cycles now, and it was the first time in Valorian history that they faced an enemy they could not defeat through strength alone, because the Crethon were not warriors or strategists, but they were a force of nature, like a plague that consumed everything in its path. Zara had lost count of how many battles she had fought against them, and how many worlds she had watched fall despite her best efforts, and the frustration burned inside her like acid, because she was supposed to be the best, and yet she was failing, and failure was not something Valorians understood. The Council had called for this emergency meeting because the Crethon had just destroyed the Pelion system, and that was 12 billion souls, gone in a matter of hours, and the Alliance was starting to fracture, as different species began to consider retreating to their homeworlds and abandoning the outer colonies to their fate. Zara turned away from the window and made her way to the conference chamber, and her footsteps echoed in the empty corridors because most of the crew was asleep, and she preferred it that way because she did not want to see the fear in their eyes when they looked at her. The chamber was already filled with representatives from 24 different species when she arrived, and they all turned to look at her with expressions ranging from hope to desperation, and she hated it because she did not have the answers they wanted. Commander Thrace of the Zelthran spoke first, and his voice was high and musical like wind chimes in a storm, and he said that his people could not continue to sacrifice their ships and crews for a war that seemed unwinnable, and several other representatives nodded in agreement. High Chancellor Mordak of the Ascended said that perhaps it was time to consider a strategic withdrawal and focus on defending core systems rather than trying to protect every colony and outpost, and Zara felt anger rise in her chest, because that was just a fancy way of saying they should give up. She was about to speak when the doors opened and a group she had never seen before walked into the chamber, and they were small compared to most species present, standing barely over 6 feet tall with smooth skin in various shades of brown and tan, and hair that grew from their heads in different colors and styles. The one in front had brown hair and green eyes, and he wore a uniform that looked primitive compared to Valorian battle armor, but he carried himself with confidence, and when he smiled it was warm and genuine and completely out of place in a war council. He introduced himself as Captain Jake Collins of the Human Defense Fleet, and said that his people had been monitoring the war from their system on the edge of known space and they wanted to help, and several representatives laughed because humans were barely a Type 1 civilization, and what could they possibly offer? Zara did not laugh because she had heard whispers about humans and their strange ability to survive things that should have killed them, and their reputation for doing impossible things through sheer stubborn refusal to accept reality. Jake did not seem bothered by the laughter, and instead he pulled up a holographic display and began explaining his plan for attacking the Crethon hive ships, and his strategy was insane because it involved flying small fighters directly into the hive cores and detonating them from inside. Commander Thrace said it was suicide because the hive ships had defenses that could shred any fighter before it got within 100 kilometers, and Jake nodded and said yes. That was true under normal circumstances, but humans did not do normal. He explained that human pilots had been training for something called atmospheric combat, where they flew at high speeds through narrow canyons and between buildings, and they had developed reflexes and instincts that were different from other species. And Zara found herself leaning forward to listen more carefully. The council debated for hours, and most wanted to reject the human offer because it seemed too risky and too desperate. But Zara stood and said that desperation was all they had left, and that she would fly with the humans on their first mission to see if their methods worked. The vote was close, but it passed, and after the meeting ended, Zara approached Jake and told him that she would be joining his squadron for the next battle, and he looked up at her with those green eyes and said that he would be honored to fly with a legend. She asked him why humans were willing to risk their lives for species they barely knew, and Jake was quiet for a moment before he said that his people had a saying about all it takes for evil to triumph is for good people to do nothing, and that humans had learned long ago that isolation was just another form of death. Over the next few days, Zara trained with the human pilots, and she was amazed by their abilities because they flew with an intuition that seemed almost supernatural, and they communicated in rapid bursts of slang and shorthand that she struggled to follow. Jake was patient with her, and he explained the human concepts of wingmen and trust and how their entire fighting style was based on the idea that no one gets left behind. And it was so different from Valorian combat doctrine, which emphasized individual glory and strength. She learned that Jake had grown up on Earth in a place called Colorado where mountains touched the sky, and he had learned to fly in something called a bush plane with his father when he was just a child, and he described the feeling of freedom and joy that came from dancing through the air. Zara told him about Valoria and the crystal forests where she had trained as a young warrior, and how the 3 moons created shadows that moved and shifted and taught fighters to never trust their eyes alone. And Jake listened with genuine interest and asked questions that showed he actually cared about understanding her culture. The night before their first mission together, Zara found herself unable to sleep, and she went to the hangar bay where Jake was working on his fighter, and he was covered in grease and humming something he called classic rock. And when he saw her, he grinned and asked if she was nervous. She said that Valorians do not get nervous, and he laughed and said that was too bad, because being nervous meant you were smart enough to understand the danger and that fear was not weakness but information. He showed her his fighter, which was small and fast and covered in decorations and symbols, and he explained that each one represented a mission or a friend or a promise, and Zara realized that humans carried their history with them in ways her people did not. She asked him if he was afraid of dying, and Jake stopped working and looked at her seriously and said that he was terrified of dying, but he was more afraid of living in a universe where he did nothing while others suffered, and that was why he fought. Zara felt something shift inside her chest, and she realized that she had spent her entire life believing that strength meant having no fear, but Jake was showing her that true strength meant being afraid and fighting anyway. The alarm sounded at dawn, and it was time for the mission, and Zara suited up alongside the human pilots, and Jake gave a briefing that was half strategy and half jokes, and somehow it made everyone relax and focus at the same time. As they walked to their fighters, Jake stopped beside her and said that he had heard Valorians had 3 hearts, and he wondered if that meant she had 3 times the courage, and Zara smiled, which was rare for her, and said that she was about to find out. They launched into space, and the Crethon hive ship loomed ahead like a massive organic asteroid covered in writhing tentacles and weapons, and Zara followed Jake as he led the squadron in a weaving pattern that seemed random, but kept them just ahead of the enemy fire. She watched in amazement as the human pilots communicated in rapid bursts and moved like a school of fish, turning and diving in perfect coordination, and she began to understand why they had survived in a hostile galaxy. Jake called out that they were going in, and Zara followed him into the narrow trench that led to the hive core, and the walls were alive and trying to crush them. But Jake flew like he was dancing, and Zara matched his movements and felt her hearts racing with something that might have been excitement. The explosion from the hive core lit up space like a newborn star, and Zara pulled her fighter hard to the right, following Jake's trajectory, as debris and fire chased them through the void, and her targeting systems were screaming warnings, but she ignored them because Jake was laughing over the comm channel, and somehow that made her feel invincible. They emerged from the blast zone and regrouped with the rest of the squadron, and out of 12 fighters that had gone in, 10 had made it out, and that was a better survival rate than any previous attack on a Crethon hive ship. And the Alliance fleet erupted in cheers over the open channel. Zara looked at her display and saw the hive ship breaking apart, and the smaller Crethon vessels were scattering without the coordination of the central mind, and the Alliance forces were pressing their advantage, and this was the first real victory they had achieved in over a cycle. Back on the flagship, the hangar bay was chaos as pilots and crew celebrated, and Jake climbed out of his cockpit and was immediately mobbed by his squadron. and they were hitting each other on the shoulders and backs in what Zara had learned was a human gesture of affection and respect. She landed her fighter, with precision, and when she emerged, the noise died down as everyone turned to look at her because Valorians did not celebrate victories, they simply prepared for the next battle. But Jake pushed through the crowd and extended his hand to her, and said that she had flown like she was born to it. Zara looked at his hand for a moment before taking it, and his grip was firm and warm, and something passed between them that she did not have words for, and the rest of the humans cheered again, and suddenly she was being pulled into their celebration. The days that followed became a blur of missions and planning sessions, and Zara found herself spending more time with Jake and his crew than with her own people. And at first, she told herself, it was just to better understand human tactics, but she knew that was a lie. Jake had a way of making everything seem less heavy, and he would tell stories about Earth between briefings and talk about things like pizza and baseball and movies, and none of it made sense to Zara, but she found herself wanting to understand because these things made him happy. She learned that humans had something they called humor, which was the ability to find lightness even in dark situations. And Jake was a master of it, and he could make his crew laugh even when they were exhausted and scared. And Zara began to see how this was its own kind of weapon. One night after a particularly brutal battle where they had lost 3 pilots, Zara found Jake sitting, alone in the observation deck, and his usual smile was gone, and he was staring out at the stars with an expression of deep sadness. She sat beside him without asking permission, and they were quiet for a long time before Jake spoke and said that he had known one of the pilots since flight school, and they had promised to visit the Grand Canyon together after the war, and now that would never happen. Zara did not know what to say, because Valorians honored their dead with silence and ceremony, but Jake was crying, and she had never seen a warrior cry before, and she thought it should seem weak, but somehow it did not. He told her that humans believed in something called grief, which was the price they paid for love, and that the pain he felt was proof that his friend's life had mattered, and Zara felt something crack inside her chest because she had lost countless warriors under her command. But she had never let herself feel anything. She asked him how he continued to fight, knowing that he might lose more people he cared about, and Jake wiped his eyes and said that was exactly why he fought, because every person saved was worth the risk, and every moment of connection was worth the potential pain. Zara reached out and put her hand on his shoulder, and it was an awkward gesture because Valorians did not do comfort, but Jake seemed to understand, and he put his hand over hers, and they sat together watching the stars. The war continued, and Jake and Zara became an unstoppable team, and the other pilots started calling them the Silver Storm, because of how Zara's ship gleamed in the light, and how they moved through battle like a force of nature. The Alliance leadership took notice, and they began assigning them the most dangerous missions. And Zara did not mind because flying with Jake made her feel alive in a way she had never experienced, and she started to understand why humans seemed to embrace danger with such enthusiasm. Between missions, Zara asked Jake to teach her about Earth, and he showed her pictures of oceans that seemed to go on forever, and forests filled with trees that were ancient, and mountains that touched clouds, and cities that glowed with light at night. She was fascinated by how diverse Earth was and how humans had created so many different cultures and languages and ways of living. And Jake explained that humans had spent most of their history fighting each other before they finally learned to work together. He asked her about Valoria, and Zara found herself talking about things she had never shared with anyone. And she told him about the crystal forests where she had trained, and how the crystals would sing when the wind blew through them, and how she had spent hours as a child just listening. She told him about the 3 moons and how each one represented a different aspect of the warrior path, and how Valorians would meditate under moonlight to find clarity and strength. And Jake listened with the same intensity. He brought to battle planning. He asked her if she had family, and Zara said that Valorians did not have families the way other species did, and that children were raised by the state to become warriors, and she had not seen her birth mother since she was 5 cycles old. Jake looked sad at that, and he told her about his parents and his younger sister, and how they would gather for something called Sunday dinner and talk and laugh and argue about meaningless things, and how he missed that more than anything. Zara asked if he regretted joining the war and leaving his family behind, and Jake was quiet before saying that he regretted the necessity of war but not his choice to fight. because some things were worth sacrificing for, and protecting people who could not protect themselves was one of them. The weeks turned into months, and the Alliance forces pushed deeper into Crethon territory, and they were winning. But the cost was high, and every victory came with losses, and Zara watched Jake carry the weight of each fallen pilot. She noticed that he kept a journal where he wrote down the names of everyone they lost, and something about them that made them unique. And he told her it was important to remember that they were not just numbers but individuals with dreams and fears and people who loved them. Zara started to understand that this was another way humans were different, because they refused to let death be meaningless, and they turned their grief into determination, and their losses into reasons to fight harder. During a supply stop at a neutral station, Jake convinced Zara to join him and his crew for what he called shore leave, and she was reluctant because Valorians did not take breaks from duty, but he said that rest was part of preparation, and she found herself agreeing. The station had a district filled with establishments from different cultures, and Jake led them to a place that served human food, and Zara tried something called a hamburger, and it was strange but not unpleasant, and she watched as the humans relaxed and joked and for a few hours forgot about the war. Jake taught her a human game called darts, where you threw small projectiles at a target, and Zara's warrior training made her naturally good at it, but Jake still managed to win by using techniques that seemed to defy physics, and he said it was all about the wrist action. Later they walked through the station's arboretum, which was filled with plants from dozens of worlds, and Jake showed her a small tree that was from Earth, and he said it was called an oak and it could live for hundreds of years. Zara touched the rough bark and felt the life pulsing through it, and she asked Jake what it was like to know that something could outlive you by so long. And he said it was comforting because it meant that life continued and that the future would exist, even when they were gone. She realized that humans had a relationship with time that was different from Valorians, and they seemed to think about legacy and what they would leave behind, while her people focused only on glory in the present moment as they walked back to the ship. Jake asked her what she planned to do after the war ended, and Zara stopped because she had never considered that question, and her entire life had been about war, and she did not know who she was without it. Jake said that he wanted to go home and see his family, and maybe teach at the flight academy and help train the next generation, and he wanted to show his sister the stars because she had always dreamed of flying, but had been too young when he left. Zara felt something she could not name stirring in her hearts, and she realized that she wanted to see Earth and experience the things Jake had told her about, and maybe learn who she could be beyond being a warrior. The intelligence reports came through in the middle of the night cycle, and Zara was awakened by the priority alert that meant something big had happened, and when she reached the command center, she found Jake already there studying the holographic displays with intense focus. The scouts had found it, and the Crethon Prime Mind and the central intelligence that controlled the entire swarm, and it was located deep in the Vortex Nebula, which was a region of space so dangerous that most ships avoided it completely because the gravitational anomalies and radiation storms could tear apart even heavily shielded vessels. High Chancellor Mordak called an emergency council meeting, and every major leader of the Alliance was present either in person or through quantum link. And the mood was tense because everyone understood that this was the moment they had been fighting toward. For 5 cycles, Commander Thrace presented the tactical analysis, and it was not good, because the Prime Mind was protected by hundreds of hive ships and thousands of smaller vessels, and the nebula itself would limit their ability to bring in capital ships, and they would have to rely on fighters and small craft. Jake stood and presented a plan that made Zara's blood run cold because it involved a small strike team penetrating the nebula, using the gravitational anomalies to mask their approach, and then fighting through to the Prime Mind chamber and destroying it from within. The council erupted in argument because it was essentially a suicide mission, and even if the strike team succeeded, they would likely not survive the blast, and several representatives said it was too high a price to pay. But Zara stood, and her voice cut through the noise like a blade, and she said that this was the only chance they would ever have, and that if they did not take it now, the war would continue for decades and billions more would die, and she volunteered to lead the strike team. Jake immediately volunteered as well, and several other human pilots followed his lead, and then warriors from the Zelthran and Ascended and even a few other Valorians stepped forward, and by the end, they had a team of 20 volunteers who knew they were probably flying to their deaths. The next few days were spent in intensive planning and preparation, and Zara found herself working alongside Jake almost constantly, and they developed a shorthand that did not require words and could anticipate each other's thoughts and strategies. The night before the mission, Jake found Zara in the training room where she was running combat simulations, and he watched her for a while before asking if she ever stopped preparing for battle, and she said that preparation was what kept warriors alive. He said that sometimes living meant doing things other than preparing to die, and he asked her to come with him, and she followed him to the hangar bay, where he had set up something strange, and there was a small table with 2 chairs and candles burning and plates of food. Zara asked what this was, and Jake said it was called a date, which was a human custom where 2 people who cared about each other spent time together and shared a meal and just existed in each other's presence without any purpose beyond connection. She sat down awkwardly because this was not something Valorians did, and they did not have customs around romantic relationships because such things were considered distractions from duty. But Jake served her food and told her stories, and slowly she began to relax. He asked her about her childhood, and Zara found herself talking about things she had buried deep, and she told him about the tests they put young Valorians through to determine who would become warriors, and how she had excelled at all of them but had always felt empty inside. She told him about the first time she killed in combat, and how everyone had celebrated her victory, but she had felt nothing except the desire to be better and stronger, and how that emptiness had driven her for decades. Jake reached across the table and took her hand, and his skin was warm against her silver flesh, and he said that maybe she'd been empty because she had never let herself feel anything, and that strength without feeling was just programming. Zara felt tears forming in her eyes, and she did not understand because Valorians did not cry and they did not show weakness, but Jake did not look at her with disgust or disappointment, and he just held her hand and waited. She asked him why he cared about her when she was a killer, who had destroyed entire fleets and brought down civilizations. And Jake said that he cared because underneath all that armor and training, he saw someone who was tired of being alone. He told her that humans believed everyone deserved connection and love regardless of what they had done, and that the ability to change and grow was what made life worth living. And Zara felt something breaking inside her, and it was painful but also freeing. She stood and Jake stood with her, and they were very close, and Zara could feel the heat radiating from his body, and she realized that she had never wanted anything as much as she wanted this moment to last forever. Jake reached up and touched her face, and his hand was gentle, and Zara leaned into the touch, and for the first time in her life, she understood what humans meant when they talked about vulnerability and trust. They stood there in the quiet of the hangar bay, and Zara felt all 3 of her hearts beating in a pattern she had never experienced before, and she realized with absolute clarity that she loved this human, and that love was the most terrifying thing she had ever encountered. He told him that she was afraid, and Jake smiled and said that fear meant she had something worth protecting, and that was the best reason to fight. And Zara understood then that she was not just fighting for the alliance or for victory, but for the chance to have a future with him. The morning of the mission came too quickly, and the strike team assembled in the briefing room, and Jake went over the plan one last time, and everyone knew their role, and everyone understood that they might not come back. Zara stood before her fellow Valorians, and she did something unprecedented, and she told them that she was honored to fight beside them, and that their courage inspired her, and several of them looked shocked because Valorian commanders did not express emotion. The flight through the nebula was the most challenging thing Zara had ever done, and the gravitational fields pulled at her fighter, and the radiation played havoc with her instruments, and she had to fly on instinct alone. Jake's voice came over the comm channel, steady and calm, as he guided the team through the chaos, and Zara marveled at how he could sound so confident when they were surrounded by death on all sides. They lost 2 fighters to a gravity well that appeared without warning, and Zara watched helplessly as they were crushed, and she felt grief hit her like a physical blow, and she understood now why Jake carried the weight of every loss. The Crethon forces detected them when they were still 20 kilometers from the Prime Mind, and suddenly space was filled with enemy fighters, and the battle was unlike anything Zara had experienced because they were fighting in 3 dimensions, while also navigating the nebula's hazards. Jake called out targets and coordinated the team with precision, and Zara flew on his wing and they moved together like they were one being. And she lost count of how many enemy ships they destroyed. A Crethon fighter got behind her, and she could not shake it, and her shields were failing and she prepared for the hit. But then Jake was there and he took the shot meant for her, and his fighter spun out of control. Zara screamed his name and she abandoned her formation and went after him, and she could hear the rest of the team calling her back, but she did not care because she could not lose him and she would not lose him. She caught his fighter in her tractor beam and pulled him away from the Crethon, and his comm was crackling with static, but she could hear him laughing and saying that she had nice reflexes, and Zara wanted to hit him and hold him at the same time, but they were not done. And the prime mine chamber was ahead, and the team had fought through, and they were all damaged and low on ammunition, and running out of time. Jake said that they needed to finish this, and Zara said that they would finish it together, and they flew side by side toward the massive organic structure that housed the prime mine. The chamber was defended by the largest Crethon warriors Zara had ever seen, and they were the size of small ships, and their weapons could tear through shields like paper. And the strike team engaged them while Jake and Zara made their run. They planted the charges on the prime mine's core, and it was pulsing with sickly green light, and Zara could feel its malevolence even through her fighter's hull. And she set the timer for 30 seconds, which was barely enough time to escape. Jake called for the team to retreat, and they turned to run, but the Crethon had closed the exit and they were trapped, and Zara felt ice flood through her veins because they were going to die here. But Jake said that there was always another way, and he found a narrow gap in the chamber wall that led to a service tunnel, and it was too small for safety and too unstable for navigation, but it was their only chance. The team followed him, and they flew through the tunnel with centimeters of clearance on all sides, and behind them, the prime mine exploded, and the shockwave chased them, and Zara could feel the heat even through her shields. They emerged from the tunnel just as it collapsed behind them, and half the strike team had made it through and the rest had been caught in the blast, and Zara felt grief and relief warring inside her. The victory celebration lasted for 3 days across every alliance world and species that had been enemies for centuries, put aside their differences to honor the warriors who had saved the galaxy, and Zara attended the ceremonies because it was expected, but she felt disconnected from it all. She stood on the stage while medals were pinned to her chest, and leaders gave speeches about her courage and skill, and called her the hero of the Alliance. But all she could think about were the faces of the warriors who had not come back. Jake stood beside her and he smiled for the crowds, but she could see the sadness in his eyes, and she knew he was thinking the same things. And when the ceremonies finally ended, they escaped to the quiet of the observation deck. They stood together looking out at the stars, and Jake said that it felt strange to not be preparing for the next battle. And Zara agreed because her entire life had been structured around war, and now that it was over, she did not know what came next. He asked her what she wanted to do now, and Zara was quiet for a long time before admitting that she had no idea, because Valorians were trained to fight and die for glory, but no one had ever taught her how to live for anything else. Jake took her hand and said that maybe they could figure it out together, and Zara felt warmth spread through her chest because the idea of facing an unknown future was terrifying. But the thought of facing it alone was worse. The Alliance Council called one final meeting to discuss demobilization and the rebuilding of worlds that had been damaged in the war, and representatives argued about resources and territory, and all the political concerns that had been set aside during the crisis. Zara sat through it feeling increasingly frustrated because these beings had fought together and bled together, but now they were already returning to old patterns of suspicion and competition. High Chancellor Mordak proposed that the Alliance should become permanent, and that they should establish a unified fleet to prevent future threats, and many supported the idea, but some wanted to return to their old sovereignty and isolation. Commander Thrace suggested that they create an exchange program where warriors and pilots from different species would train together and share knowledge, and Zara found herself standing to support the idea because she had learned more from flying with humans than from decades of Valorian training. Jake also stood and proposed that they establish a memorial station where the names of every being who died in the war would be recorded and honored, and the council agreed, and Zara felt grateful because she did not want those sacrifices to be forgotten. After the meeting, Jake told Zara that he was going home to Earth, and he said it casually, but she could hear the tension in his voice, like he was afraid of her response, and Zara felt panic rise in her throat. She asked if he wanted her to come with him, and Jake turned to look at her with surprise and hope, and he said that he had been afraid to ask because he did not know if she would want to leave her people. Zara laughed, and it was a sound she rarely made, and she said that her people had never really been hers, and that the only place she wanted to be was wherever he was, and Jake pulled her close and held her. The journey to Earth took 2 weeks because they traveled on a civilian transport rather than a military vessel, and Zara spent the time learning about human culture and customs and trying to prepare herself for a world she had only heard about in stories. Jake warned her that Earth was very different from the sterile environments of military ships, and that it could be overwhelming with its diversity and noise and chaos, but Zara said she had faced down the Crethon swarm, and she could handle one planet. They arrived at a space station orbiting Earth, and Zara pressed her face to the viewport and stared at the blue and green world below, and it was beautiful in a way she had not expected, because most worlds she had seen were either hostile or artificially maintained. Jake pointed out the continents and oceans and told her about the different climates and regions, and Zara tried to absorb it all, but there was too much, and she felt excitement and fear mixing together in her hearts. The shuttle ride down through the atmosphere was turbulent, and Zara gripped her seat because she was used to the smooth transition of military craft, but Jake just laughed and said this was normal, and that Earth liked to remind visitors that it was still a wild place. They landed at a spaceport in Colorado, and the moment the doors opened, Zara was hit by sensations she had never experienced, and there was wind that carried the scent of growing things, and the air was thick and rich, and she could hear sounds of birds and insects. Jake led her through the spaceport, and people stared because Valorians were rare on Earth, and her silver skin and 7-foot height made her stand out. But Jake seemed unconcerned, and he just kept walking. They took a ground transport to his family home, and Zara watched the landscape pass by, and there were mountains rising in the distance, with white peaks and forests that seemed to go on forever, and wide open spaces that made her feel small in a way that space never had. Jake's home was a simple structure made of wood and stone, and it sat on a hillside overlooking a valley. And there were fields of crops growing and animals grazing, and Zara thought it looked peaceful in a way that was completely foreign to her. His family came out to meet them, and his mother was a small woman with gray hair and kind eyes, and his father was tall with weathered skin and a firm handshake, and his sister was young and energetic, and she immediately started asking Zara questions about space battles. Jake's mother pulled him into a hug, and she was crying and saying that she had been so worried, and Jake held her and told her he was safe now, and Zara watched the exchange with fascination because Valorians did not show affection like this. His father shook Zara's hand and thanked her for keeping his son alive, and Zara did not know how to explain that Jake had saved her far more than she had saved him, but she nodded and said it had been an honor. They went inside, and the house was filled with objects that seemed to have no purpose except to be beautiful or meaningful, and there were pictures on the wall showing Jake and his family at different ages and in different places. Jake's mother prepared food, and it was called a home-cooked meal, and Zara sat at the table with his family, and they talked and laughed and asked her questions and treated her like she belonged there. His sister wanted to hear stories about the war, and Jake deflected by talking about the other pilots and the funny moments between battles, and Zara realized he was protecting his family from the darker truths. After dinner, Jake showed Zara around the property, and they walked through the fields as the sun set, and the sky turned colors that Zara had never seen before, because Valoria had a different sun and different atmosphere. He pointed out the stars that were starting to appear, and showed her which ones were part of the Alliance and which ones were unexplored. And Zara thought about how small Earth seemed from space, but how vast it felt when you were standing on it. She asked Jake how humans lived, with knowing they were just one small world in a huge galaxy. And he said that was exactly what made life precious, because every moment and every connection mattered when you understood how rare and fragile it all was. They sat on a hillside and watched the night sky, and Zara leaned against Jake and felt his warmth and his heartbeat. And she thought about how strange it was that she had traveled across the galaxy and fought in countless battles, But this moment of peace was harder to accept than any of it. Jake said that his mother wanted Zara to stay with them for as long as she wanted, and that they had a guest room they could convert for her. And Zara felt something in her chest tighten because she had never had a place that was her. She asked Jake what he planned to do now that the war was over, and he said he was thinking about taking a position at the flight academy, teaching new pilots, but he also wanted to spend time with his family and maybe help his father with the farm. Zara said she did not know what Valorians did in peacetime because she had never experienced it, and Jake said that maybe she could figure out what Zara wanted to do separate from what Valorians were supposed to do over the following weeks. Zara settled into life on Earth, and it was harder than she expected because she was used to structure and orders and clear objectives. But civilian life was messy and unpredictable and full of choices. Jake's mother taught her how to cook and garden, and Zara found the repetitive tasks soothing in a way that combat never was. And she liked the feeling of creating something rather than destroying. His sister took her hiking in the mountains and showed her the wildlife and taught her the names of plants and trees, and Zara was amazed by how much diversity existed in one small region. His father taught her about the farm and how to care for animals and work the land, and Zara discovered that her Valorian strength was useful for things other than fighting. Jake took her to town and introduced her to other humans, and some were afraid of her at first, but most were curious and welcoming, and Zara slowly learned how to exist in a society that was not based on military hierarchy. She attended community gatherings and festivals and celebrations and experienced things like music and dancing and art, and all the aspects of culture that Valorians dismissed as frivolous, but that humans considered essential. At night she and Jake would sit on the porch and talk about their days and make plans for the future, and Zara found herself thinking in terms of years and decades rather than the next mission. 6 months after arriving on Earth, Zara received a message from the Valorian High Command, and they were ordering her to return home to receive honors and take a position training the next generation of warriors. And the message was phrased as a request, but Zara knew it was really a command. She sat in the guest room that had become hers and stared at the message for a long time, and part of her felt the old pull of duty and obligation because she was Valorian, and Valorians served their people. But another part of her resisted because she had finally found something that felt like peace. Jake found her there, and he sat beside her without speaking and just waited until she was ready to talk. And Zara showed him the message and watched his face carefully to see his reaction. He read it slowly and then asked her what she wanted to do, and Zara said she did not know, because for her entire life she had never been allowed to choose what she wanted, and she had always done what was expected. Jake took her hand and said that she had earned the right to make her own choices, and that whatever she decided he would support her, and if she wanted to return to Valoria he would understand, even though it would break his heart. Zara felt tears forming in her eyes, and she said that was the problem, because part of her felt like she should return and fulfill her duty. But the thought of leaving Earth and leaving him made her feel like she was dying inside. She told him about Valorian culture and how individualism was seen as weakness and how warriors were expected to sacrifice everything for the collective, and how choosing personal happiness over duty was considered the ultimate betrayal. Jake listened, and then he said something that changed everything, and he said that maybe the greatest act of courage was not dying for others, but choosing to live for yourself, and that real strength meant breaking chains even when they were forged by your own people. Zara thought about all the battles she had fought and all the victories she had won, and she realized that none of them had required as much courage as this moment, and choosing to stay on Earth and build a life with Jake was scarier than facing the Crethon had ever been. She composed a response to the High Command, and her hands shook as she typed, because she was refusing a direct order and declaring that she was staying on Earth and pursuing a life outside of military service. And she knew there would be consequences. The response came within hours, and it was harsh and filled with disappointment and accusations of betrayal. And they stripped her of her rank and her honors and declared that she was no longer welcome among Valorians. Zara read the message and felt a strange mix of grief and relief because she had lost everything she had worked for. But she had also been freed from expectations that had weighed on her for decades. Jake held her while she cried, and he did not try to fix it or tell her it would be okay, and he just let her feel what she needed to feel. And Zara was grateful because she was learning that healing required feeling the pain first. Over the following weeks, Zara struggled with her decision, and there were days when she wondered if she had made a mistake and if she should return and beg for forgiveness. But then she would watch Jake laugh with his family, or feel the sun on her face, or taste food she had helped grow. And she knew she had chosen correctly. She started working with Jake at the flight academy. And at first the human students were intimidated by her. But she learned to soften her approach and share her knowledge in ways that inspired rather than frightened. She taught them about three-dimensional combat and how to stay calm under pressure and how to work as a team, and the students thrived under her instruction. And Zara discovered that teaching gave her a sense of purpose. She had never found in combat Jake taught alongside her, and they developed a curriculum that combined human intuition with Valorian discipline, and the Academy's graduation rates improved, and their students went on to distinguished careers. In the evening, Zara continued to learn about Earth and human culture, and Jake's mother taught her about art and music, and she discovered that she had an affinity for sculpture, and she started creating pieces from stone and metal. Her art was dark at first, filled with images of war and loss, but slowly it began to change, and she started creating pieces that celebrated life and connection and beauty. And humans who saw her work said it moved them in ways they could not explain. Jake's sister graduated from university, and she joined the diplomatic corps, and she credited Zara with inspiring her because seeing someone from such a warrior culture choose peace had shown her that change was possible. The seasons changed, and Zara experienced her first Earth winter, and she was amazed by snow and how it transformed the landscape into something magical. And Jake taught her how to ski, and they spent days in the mountains laughing as she crashed repeatedly before finally getting the hang of it. Spring came, and Jake's father taught her about planting and nurturing new growth, and Zara found deep satisfaction in working with the soil and watching things grow from seeds into plants that would feed people. Summer brought festivals and celebrations, and Zara attended them all, and she learned human dances and tasted foods from different cultures and made friends with people who saw her as more than just a warrior. Autumn arrived with its colors and harvest, and Zara helped bring in the crops and preserve food for winter, and she thought about how different this was from the Valorian way, where everything came from synthesizers and nothing was grown or nurtured. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Jake asked Zara if she had any regrets, and she was quiet for a long time before answering. She said that she regretted the years she had spent believing that strength meant having no feelings, and that duty meant sacrificing happiness. And she regretted all the connections she had avoided because she thought they made her weak. But she did not regret coming to Earth, and she did not regret choosing love over duty. And she did not regret becoming someone new, because the person she had been was powerful, but empty, and the person she was becoming was vulnerable. But whole Jake said that he was proud of her, and that it took more courage to change than to stay the same. And Zara leaned against him and felt grateful for this human who had shown her that there was more to life than war. A year after leaving the military, Zara received another message, but this one was not from Valorian High Command, and it was from young Valorian warriors who had heard her story, and they wanted to know how she had found the courage to choose a different path. Zara spent days crafting her response, and she told them that courage was not about fearlessness but about acknowledging fear and choosing to act anyway, and that true strength came from vulnerability and connection, not from isolation and dominance. She told them that Valorian culture had given them many gifts, including discipline and skill and resilience, but it had also taken things from them, like the ability to form deep bonds and experience joy, and live for something beyond the next battle. She said that she did not regret her time as a warrior, and that those experiences had shaped her, but she also did not regret leaving, because growth required stepping into the unknown and trusting that there was more to life than what they had been taught. The responses started, coming in slowly at first and then in a flood. And young Valorians from across the Empire were reaching out and asking questions and sharing their own doubts and dreams, and Zara realized she had started something. She created a communication network for Valorians who wanted to explore different paths, and she shared resources about other cultures and ways of living, and she offered support to those who faced backlash from choosing change. Jake helped her manage the growing community, and he connected her with humans who had experience with cultural transition, and together they built a program that helped Valorians integrate into civilian life. The Valorian High Command sent warnings and threats, but they could not stop the movement because it was being driven by individuals making personal choices, and the Empire learned that you cannot command someone to stop growing. 2 years after coming to Earth, Jake took Zara on a hike to a special place high in the mountains, and they climbed for hours until they reached a meadow filled with wildflowers and surrounded by peaks. He told her that this was where he had come as a child, when he needed to think and make important decisions, and that he wanted to share it with her because she had become the most important part of his life. Then he knelt down and pulled out a small box, and inside was a ring, and he asked her if she would marry him in the human tradition and build a life together, and Zara said yes, before he even finished asking why. Were married in the meadow, surrounded by Jake's family and friends, and a few former squadron members who had traveled from across the galaxy to attend, and Zara wore a dress that Jake's mother had helped her choose. During the ceremony, Zara spoke about how she had spent her life believing that love was weakness and that connection was a liability. But Jake had taught her that love was the strongest force in the universe because it gave you something worth fighting for and something worth living for. Jake spoke about how Zara had shown him that courage came in many forms, and that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was let someone see your vulnerability and trust them with your heart.